Hello, genealogist. It's Craig, and this is Just Genealogy. And today we're going to talk about the Spanish American War. So, it's a war that not too many people think about. This is an interesting painting right here on hill with the cavalry. There's only one unfortunate problem: their horses never left Florida, they were all on foot. So, anyway, if you've listened to me talk about war before, you'll know that I believe you have to understand the war, you have to understand the organizations involved in the war, and you have to understand the records. And that you also need some sort of search strategy in order to do a good job at getting things done. You can read all about how the war started. Remember the Maine blown up in Havana Harbor? Some people think that somebody other than the Spanish blew it up. The records that we're going to be dealing with today are largely found originally in the National Archives. And in fact, there is a military resources page for the Spanish-American War and the Philippine Insurrection. These are two different wars that occurred at about the same time, one pretty much the result of the other. And we'll talk about that. There also is a prologue article that you should take a look at on researching service in the Army during the Philippine Insurrection when we get to that second part, done by Trevor Plant, who is, I think, currently the head of research in the National Archives at this point in time, or whatever they call him. Good guy. You also want to take a look at the Center for Military History, because they will have information on the war with Spain and also information on the Philippine Insurrection. So you can go there. I want to focus pretty much on Texas today, just for fun. There is a military forces museum in Texas. They have a website, and they have information about Texas' involvement in the Spanish-American War. Whatever state you're looking for, go and look for a state armed forces military museum of some sort. Go and look for a website, look for the adjutant general. But if you just type the name of the state in Spanish-American War, you should be able to get to something. There is a website out there called Span Am War, and you will find that it is also helpful in pointing out various things that you should be able to get to rather easily. So let's talk about Texas. So there is the Texas Volunteer Guard at this point in time. The National Guard by this point in time is a very young organization. But during the Spanish-American War, 4 of the companies of the 1st Regiment Texas Volunteer Guard were in federal service. Company B, the Houston Light Guards, Company F, the Bayou City Guards, Company G, the Fayette Guards, and Company H of the 1st Infantry Texas Volunteer Guard were designated in the federal service as Companies A, C, D, and E of the 1st Texas Volunteers, respectively. Some of the other Guard units were the Company A, the Austin Grays, Company B, the Bryan Rifles, and on and on. A, B, C, G, H, and then there were federally designated units in Companies F, G, H, K, and L, and they were known also as the 1st Texas Volunteers, respectively. So between these two sets of units, we were able to create the 1st Texas Volunteer Infantry. So it was organized in April of 1898 and mustered in Austin, and it would in 1899 muster out in Galveston, and it did go to Cuba. It left in December of 1898, and it left Cuba on 25 March 1899, returning to the States on 2 April 1899. So the regiment was composed of separate companies from various parts of the state. It was commanded by different folk, one named Mabry and one named Dwyer. during the war, and then stationed during the war in Mobile, Alabama to start with, then Miami, then Jacksonville, and then Savannah, and then finally Cuba. According to the Ainsworth list, there were 46 officers mustered in, 46 officers mustered out, but there were a total of 60 officers during the period of its life as the 1st Texas Volunteer Infantry. There were 956 men when they mustered in, 822 men when they mustered out, but a total of 1,337 men went through the unit. So if we look at the losses while in service, we see that 13 officers resigned or were discharged and 1 died of disease. Enlisted men, 46 were transferred, 57 were discharged for disability, 3 were discharged by general court-martial, 379 were discharged by order, 14 died of disease, 1 died of an accident, and 15 deserted. So they served in the Army of Occupation in Cuba from December 1898 to March of 1899, and upon mustering out of the federal service, the regiment returned to state status. In 1903, the regiment was redesignated the 1st Infantry Texas National Guard. In 1908, it discontinued as an administrative unit. It remained inactive until 1917, when it was reorganized and consolidated with the 2nd Infantry to form the 141st U.S. Infantry. Company D was known as the Calvert City Guards before the war, and it became Company M of the 2nd Texas Volunteers, and Company K became Company A of the 2nd. The 2nd Texas Volunteer Infantry mustered in Austin, mustered out in Dallas, and never left the United States. When you look at the accounting, there were 46 officers mustering in, 45 mustered out, but there were a total of 49 over time, and you can see the enlisted men numbers. So their losses, there were 4 resigned or discharged officers, 110 enlisted men were transferred, 50 were discharged for disability, 1 was discharged by general court-martial, 56 were discharged by order, 15 died of disease, and 4 deserted. The regiment was composed of 12 separate companies from various parts of the state, and it was stationed in Mobile, Miami, and Jacksonville, and Savannah. And from Savannah, they went back to Dallas. And again, they didn't leave the United States. In 1903, the 2nd Regiment Texas Volunteer Guards was designated the 2nd Infantry Texas National Guard, and in 1917, guess what? The 2nd Infantry was consolidated with the 1st Infantry to form the 141st U.S. Infantry. Then there was the 3rd Texas Volunteer Infantry. It was a regiment composed of 12 separate companies from around the state. It also did not leave the states. In fact, it was stationed in Texas during the entire war. And again, see, the mustering in and mustering out enlisted and officers is pretty common to have it look like this for a unit that does not go overseas. The 4th Texas Volunteer Infantry, only 1 company, the Tom Hamilton Guards of Huntsville, belonged to the Texas Volunteer Guard. The other companies were selected from different points of the state. Edmonds was its commanding officer during war operations. It also was stationed in Texas. I think this is a picture of the 4th Texas Infantry. Then there was the 1st Texas Cavalry. Austin, Fort Sam, no service beyond the United States. Same kinds of numbers. Promoted or transferred 1, resigned or discharged 6. 3 died of disease. No general court-martials in this unit, but 1 guy was murdered, or there was a homicide. And 12 separate troops from various parts of the state mustered for the war. It was commanded by Colonel Luther R. Hare, and we'll encounter him later on. And it was stationed throughout the war in Texas. Now, I got my numbers from the list of the Adjutant General's Office for Carded Records of Military Organizations, Revolutionary War through Philippine Insurrection, the Ainsworth list. You can find the Ainsworth list on Family Search. I usually, if I'm dealing with looking at a unit in any war from the Revolution through the Mexican Border War, I'm going to be looking at Ainsworth list to know what muster rolls, payrolls might be available and what the dates are, mustering in, mustering out, that kind of thing. It's a consolidated list of all the muster rolls that they came across. Now, it's not a name list, it's a numbers list. Now, here's a picture of what Teddy Roosevelt and his men actually look like while they were in Cuba. Notice, no horses. They made up the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, and this unit was mustered into service between 1 May and 21 May 1898 in various locations in Texas, which is part of the reason why I picked Texas, New Mexico, and what was then termed Indian Territory, which would be Arizona or Oklahoma. There were 47 officers, 994 enlisted men. From San Antonio, they went to Tampa, and they were assigned to the same transport, the SS Yucatan. Only 8 of the regiment's 12 troops, the A, B, D, E, F, G, K, and L. The other 4 troops, C, H, I, and M, much to their chagrin, remained behind in Florida. Also, the regiment had to leave its horses behind in Florida, and it essentially served in Cuba as an infantry regiment. So the various places they served were, we know about San Juan and Kettle Hills, and Roosevelt would eventually be awarded the Medal of Honor, which he wouldn't get until 80 years after his death. After the fighting ended and the summer war on disease among the troops began to rise, and more people died that way than actually from the Spanish. They arrived back in the U.S. on the 15th of August, 3 days after the armistice had been declared, and went into camp at Montauk Point, Long Island. Of course, Long Island, near where Teddy lived. The unit was mustered out of service in 15 September 1898. So at the time of mustering out, the unit consisted of 52 officers and 1,185 enlisted men. During its term of service, the unit lost 2 officers and 21 enlisted men killed in action, and 3 more men died of wounds received in battle. 19 men died of disease and 12 men deserted. Additionally, 7 officers and 97 enlisted men were wounded. The Rough Riders had the highest casualty rate of all the regiments involved in the actions in Cuba. It was only in existence 133 days, yet everybody knows about the Rough Riders. Then there was the Philippine-American War from 1899 to 1902, and there's lots of stuff out on the web on that. Basically, we bought the Philippines, and then we determined to take advantage of that situation much more than we should have, and we determined not to grant the Philippines independence. This sort of ticked some Filipino people off, and they decided that they would fight about it. And they fought about it until 1902, and then there was guerrilla action after that a little bit, and there was an occupation force. So between July of 1902 and December 1904, and then late in 1905, the Army dispatched a series of expeditions into the interior of Mindanao to destroy some Moro strongholds. And in 1906, the Battle of Budaho was fought to a successful conclusion by regulars, and by mid-June 1913, Moros at Bagsak were beaten. So we were there for a while. The mainstay of us being there was the 33rd U.S. Infantry, which arrived in 1899 under the command of General Lloyd Wheaton. A bunch of Texans fought in various places. They were organized and led the Gilmore Rescue Party, for which they received worldwide recognition, and then 2 Silver Star citations for gallantry and left the Philippines early in 1901 with the rank of Brigadier General of Volunteers. He was followed by Luther Hare, who you remember was serving in the 1st Texas Cavalry in the Spanish-American War. Well, he would be a colonel of the 33rd U.S. Infantry during the Philippine Insurrection. He was a graduate of West Point, class of 74, and he was present at Little Bighorn 24 years before. So you want to take a look at what's available at the United States Army Heritage Collection online that deals with the war. They have some surveys available. They actually have survey inventories for the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and for the Korean War. They surveyed 8,000 veterans based on pensions. And the Texas box 30, has 43 folders of information relating to specific individuals. Many of them were still living in 1968. Another place for information is going to be Record Group 94. The preliminary inventory of the records of the Adjutant General's office is the finding aid, PI 17, for those records. And let's get into a search strategy. So you want to know about the person. You want to have knowledge of their family. You want to have knowledge of their service. You want to know what NAR records are available, what manuscript records are available, what state and local records are available, and what maps. So if you've got a guy who was an officer, the place to look is Francis Heitman's Historical Register of the Dictionary of the United States Army. And it covers up through the Philippine Insurrection, and it is available on Ancestry and available on Fold 3 and available on my bookshelf if you would like to ask me to do a lookup. If you're dealing with an enlisted man, you want to look at the Register of Enlistments, which is available on both Ancestry and Fold 3. And it looks something like this on one side of the page, and something like this on the other side of the page. In my own case, my great-grandfather was in the 13th U.S. Cavalry in 1906, 1907 timeframe, and he deserted from the Army. He was gone for a year, and he was captured. He was living within a couple of miles of Fort Hamilton in New York at the time. He had a court-martial and was found guilty, and the Army provided him with a all-expense-paid trip to Kansas, where he spent a year at Leavenworth, was dishonorably discharged, and then pardoned by the Attorney General. He belonged to the correct political party at the time. And the circumstances under which he became a deserter were, based on his court-martial, that the unit was going to the Philippines. He had never told the Army that he was married, and he also had a child, and he did not wish to abandon his wife and child to go to the Philippines. No one in the family knew this, and I didn't tell very many of them, but I've been talking about it for a while. If you've got people in the Navy Marine Corps that's an officer, you want to look at Callahan, list of officers in the Navy. And the United States Marine Corps, you will find that also on Ancestry. And it will provide you information about, in the vignette, at least the name, history, and death of the individual. There are also, in Record Group 217, Entry 818, muster rolls and payrolls and receipt rolls for ships and shore units covering the period. Then that's only for the Navy. Then we have compiled military service records. Well, we don't have very many of those. What we have is Florida, and it's out on Fold 3. But we do have a Spanish-American War Service Records Index, which will tell us how to get to the records in the National Archives, tell us what records to ask for. And the information is included in the Military Services Catalog. This is also downloadable off of archives.gov. So here is a compiled military service record of Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, F&S, that's Field and Staff Company, 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry. So these cards are created from muster rolls, and in this time period, muster rolls are rather large, and they likely will not be served to you by the National Archives. So the first thing you want to get your hands on is the pension. And if there is a pension, then you want to determine what unit the individual is in, and then you want to go and then get the compiled military service record. You don't want to make the mistake of pulling the wrong military service record. So the pension application files are in the National Archives. There is on Ancestry the General Index, and this is known as the Civil War Index, even though it includes information from the Spanish-American War. Also out, and one of those cards looks a little bit like this. And usually they are stamped with the words War with Spain. Also out on fold 3, there will be the organizational cards. I've talked about this same information in the video that deals with Civil War pension indexes. The process is exactly the same, and I urge you to go and take a look at that. So you want to look at both the index card on Ancestry, because the wife will be there, and you also want to look at the card on fold 3. The wife will not be there, but there will be a date of death for War with Spain people usually. And you will also be able to see everybody else in the unit, because these on fold 3 are at the company level. Everybody else in the unit that got a pension. And your guy may not have gotten a pension, but you may find information in some other guy's pension that will be helpful to your research. So this was a quick dive into the Spanish-American War and the Philippine Insurrection. There are compiled military service records. There are pensions. There is also a lot of information on the web at both the state and the war level that you should have a look at. And don't forget the Center for Military History. So this is Craig with Just Genealogy, converting people doing genealogy into genealogists day by day. Another day has gone by. If you have any questions, or if you would like me to take a look at something, just put it in the comments. I appreciate you all. Thank you very much.